The motive of a crime often remains a mystery for investigators. What drives a person to so coldly deal with their own family before ending their own life, and why sometimes someone is left alive, is a question difficult to find a definitive answer to. On that Monday morning, April 22, 2024, at 9:35 a.m., the police dispatch operator in Yukon, Oklahoma, could barely calm the telephone caller. On the line was a 10-year-old boy, who through sobs tried to describe a horrific event. His voice trembled with fear and despair as he attempted to explain that his parents were lying on the floor in blood and urgently needed help. Barely controlling his emotions, the child managed to provide the home address. Immediately, a group of police officers was dispatched to the scene, who did not even suspect what a terrifying picture awaited them in this seemingly ordinary house. The main character of this tragic story was Jonathan Cendy, a 42-year-old engineer who worked at the Professional Basketball Center in Oklahoma City. For over 10 years, the man had consistently built a career in sports and technical fields, providing a comfortable life for his family. By 2024, John had been married for 10 years to Lindsay Cendy, a 39-year-old woman. The couple settled in the small cozy town of Yukon near Oklahoma, which had slightly over 20,000 residents. It seemed like exactly the place where one could create an ideal family atmosphere. Over the years of marriage, the Cendys had 4 children, 18-year-old Dylan, 14-year-old Todd, 12-year-old Luke, and the youngest 10-year-old child, whose identity was not disclosed due to their vulnerable age. Spring 2024 would forever be etched in the memory of this youngest child as a time of unbearable pain and traumatic experience. To those around them, the Cendy family seemed like an embodiment of the American dream, friendly, close-knit, a classic family unit raising children in the calmest and safest suburb of the state. The parents always cared about their children's comfort and future, giving them freedom of choice and support. The eldest son, Ethan Alokas, had graduated high school in 2023 and was ready to start adult life. He was actively preparing for college admission while simultaneously working at a local enterprise. The young man did not want to be a burden to his parents and demonstrated remarkable independence. None of the family members showed any signs of mental disorders. Their life before the tragic events seemed absolutely ordinary and calm. The parents were far from conflicts, and the children had complete support and understanding. They were regular visitors to a local bakery, even appearing in advertisements as favorite customers. The day before, on April 21, 2024, the entire family gathered together. The older children, returning from walks with friends, were preparing for the work week, planning to go to bed early. No one even suspected the horrific fate awaiting this seemingly prosperous family. The atmosphere seemed perfect, a quiet family dinner, shared plans, a typical pre-evening time in a cozy suburban house. However, behind this external propriety, a terrible secret was about to be revealed. That Sunday evening, everything seemed ordinary for the Cendy family, as if nothing foreboded the future tragedy. After dinner, Jonathan decided to rest, and the children retreated to their rooms on the second floor. The house's silence was suddenly broken by the voices of the parents. Sounds of an argument, increasingly resembling a genuine conflict, came from the first floor. The children heard their parents' voices becoming louder and more emotional. It seemed the tension between Jonathan and Lindsay had reached a critical point. Although the reason for the argument remained unknown, it was evident that Jonathan was in a state of uncontrollable rage. The atmosphere in the house was so tense it seemed about to explode. However, none of the children paid particular attention to this quarrel, such conflicts had happened before. In the youngest boy's room, a fan was working, muffling the sounds coming from the lower floors. He had no idea what tragedy was unfolding literally nearby. Suddenly, the fire alarm went off. According to forensic experts, this occurred due to gunpowder gases formed during shooting. The sharp beeping of the sensor awakened the 10-year-old boy, who until that moment had been sleeping soundly. Bewildered by the unexpected signal, he got up and began carefully looking around. The doors to his brother's rooms were left open, which seemed strange to him, but not enough to cause serious concern. The boy decided that perhaps everyone was already awake because of the alarm. Descending the stairs to the first floor, he noticed the light was on in the living room. He called out to his parents and brothers several times, but heard only the continuous beeping of the alarm. The child's heart began to beat faster with a premonition of something terrible. When the boy entered the living room, his gaze immediately fell on the bloody stains covering the walls and furniture. In the middle of the room, his parents, Jonathan and Lindsay, lay motionless. The man was lying on his wife, with a wound to the head. Fear and shock paralyzed the child. He rushed to his parents, trying to revive them, not fully comprehending the scale of the tragedy. The cold bodies of his parents, the bloody wounds, all of it seemed impossible, like a horrific dream. Receiving no response, the boy began calling his brothers, hoping that someone could help. He could not believe he was left alone. Checking his older children's rooms, he found the same horrific scene, blood everywhere, motionless bodies. Confusion was replaced by a realization of the need to act. Through tears and fear, the boy managed to dial the rescue service number. His trembling voice could barely convey information to the dispatcher: someone had killed his parents and brothers. On that Monday morning at the Oklahoma police station, a phone call rang out that would forever change the life of a small boy. The unspeakable horror of a family tragedy was just beginning its terrifying narrative. On that fateful day, the 10-year-old boy, in a state of shock, managed to gather his last strength and open the door for the arriving law enforcement officers. Police officers and paramedics, entering the premises, immediately understood the full horror of what they saw: there was no salvation. The bodies of family members had been in the house for several hours. This was evidenced by characteristic signs: congealed blood on the floor, exhausted poses of the deceased. The parents and older brothers were declared dead at the crime scene. The police immediately surrounded the house with a special restrictive tape, launching an urgent investigation of the bloody tragedy. Forensic experts and detectives who arrived at the scene reconstructed the tragedy with horror. The version of external intervention was instantly rejected. No signs of violent entry into the house were found. The doors and windows were in an undamaged state, no break-in traces were recorded. The most horrifying version began to take shape quite quickly: the murder was most likely committed by one of the family members. The 10-year-old witness, covered in blood, immediately came under the close attention of law enforcement. Police officers even suspected his possible involvement in the tragedy, as such cases had occurred in practice. However, a detailed investigation quickly dispelled all doubts about the child. Expertise proved the absence of gunshot residue on his hands, and no juvenile fingerprints were found on the discovered weapon. Forensic experts meticulously examined every square meter of the premises, checking the possibility of staging the crime. Street surveillance cameras captured only the Cendy family members returning from the store in the evening. No third-party movement was recorded. The boy told investigators that he had heard an argument between his parents before falling asleep. The pose found near the weapon eloquently testified that the father, 42-year-old Jonathan, was the main suspect in the murder of his own family. Forensic experts became increasingly convinced of his coldness and cruelty. The question of motive remained mysterious: why did a loving father suddenly turn into a murderer? Why did he kill his wife and children, leaving the youngest son alive? No note or explanation was found. The forensic examination of the murder weapon confirmed the worst suspicions: all family members, including Jonathan himself, were killed with the same pistol. Only his fingerprints were found on the weapon's grip, which ultimately excluded the version of third-party intervention. The course of the crime itself turned out to be the most horrifying. No defensive reaction, no resistance, as if the family was in a state of complete defenselessness. First, Jonathan killed his wife, who did not die immediately. While the woman was slowly dying in a pool of blood, the man went upstairs and methodically killed the sleeping sons. Lindsay likely heard everything that was happening but was absolutely helpless. Detectives called this tragedy an extremely strange incident. None of the acquaintances could even suggest that the respectable family man Jonathan was capable of such an act. There were no criminal episodes in his biography. The police had never been called for conflicts or domestic violence. That is why law enforcement initially considered alternative versions, from robbery to attacks by third parties. The investigation continued, leaving many questions unanswered. The investigation into the tragedy encountered increasingly more mysteries. It seemed that this pleasant, sociable family could not have had enemies, let alone reasons for such unprecedented aggression from Jonathan. Police experts conducted thorough investigations that ultimately confirmed the head of the family's involvement in the crime. Law enforcement officers began large-scale interviews with relatives and neighbors, trying to comprehend what could have pushed the once loving family man to such a horrific act. Everyone who knew the Cendy family unanimously characterized them as an exemplary and friendly family. Over years of communication, no one could recall any conflict or criminal episode. Jonathan seemed the embodiment of decency and calm, the last person who could resort to a weapon. The tragedy was most shocking for the relatives. They categorically refused to accept the reality that Jonathan had committed these acts. Upon hearing the official confirmation of his involvement in the murder, the family members fell into indignation, calling the man a psychopath and refusing to even mention his name. Previously, there had been minor misunderstandings between the spouses, but they never became serious. Jonathan always demonstrated remarkable restraint, never showing a tendency towards sharp actions. That is why what happened became an unprecedented shock for everyone who knew him. Local media began actively discussing the tragedy, trying to learn as many details as possible. Journalists literally hunted for a sensation, and only thanks to the efforts of law enforcement were they able to protect the only survivor, the minor witness to this terrible story. The investigation established that the day before the tragedy, the Cendy family was living an ordinary life. They had time to visit the store, the older children met with friends, and in the evening gathered together again. According to the younger son, that day the father behaved absolutely normally, showing no signs of aggression or anxiety. Unexpected information was provided by 68-year-old neighbor Michael Boru. The men were longtime friends, often helping each other with household chores and maintaining friendly relations. It was Michael who had learned about Jonathan's hidden problem, a depressive state. According to the neighbor, several years ago Jonathan confessed that he suffered from depression and was taking medications prescribed by a doctor. He tried to hide this fact from others, although he had confided in Michael. At the time, the man occasionally spoke disparagingly about his wife, but nothing indicated the possibility of such a horrific outcome. Later, Jonathan assured that he had overcome depression, returned to a normal state, and no longer felt the previous negative emotions. He explained his former dissatisfaction as a temporary painful condition. Investigators meticulously checked Jonathan's medical documentation, hoping to find at least a hint of the tragedy's cause. However, no compromising materials or records of mental state deterioration in recent times were discovered. The mystery of the Cendy family remained unsolved, and the motives for the crime remained unclear. The investigation of the Cendy case was extremely challenging. Medical specialists, including psychiatrists and psychologists, were not initially involved in studying the biographies of the deceased, as there were no obvious prerequisites for an in-depth psychological analysis. Police encountered a serious problem: no witness noticed any suspicious circumstances before the tragedy. Relatives repeatedly confirmed that Jonathan had previously overcome depression, which had passed several years ago, but at the time it did not cause serious concern. His mother claimed that her son quickly overcame that difficult period, and his wife continuously supported her husband. Acquaintances of the Cendy family unanimously assured that they noticed no signs of danger or threatening changes in Jonathan's behavior. Moreover, after overcoming depression, the couple's life became more harmonious and fulfilling. They actively communicated, often arranged meetings with friends, weekly barbecues. The last such event took place on April 20th, when the couple was at Michael's. The only hypothesis that could somehow explain the tragedy was hidden depression. However, even psychiatrists considered it unlikely that a man could have hidden serious psychological problems under such active social circumstances. The version about marital infidelity also did not withstand verification. An initial review of social media correspondence revealed no intrigues or conflicts. The police hoped to find important evidence in the couple's mobile phones and computers, but the preliminary analysis did not yield the expected results. The most interesting witness was the 10-year-old boy, the only family member who miraculously survived the tragedy. He was handed over to relatives on his mother's side. The child's condition caused serious concern. He was in deep shock, constantly screaming in his sleep, admitting that he did not want to live. Concerned people created a special fund to support the child. By 2024, they had managed to collect over $74,000 of the planned $100,000. Several psychologists worked with the boy, as there was a real risk of serious psychological trauma. The investigation continued, but there was a lack of decisive evidence capable of explaining the reason for the horrific massacre in the Cendy family. The family circle united to support the child and help them overcome a horrific psychological trauma. It was clear that numerous challenges and emotionally difficult periods lay ahead. When experts determined that the child was ready for communication, a delicate decision was made to conduct an interview to obtain at least some eyewitness testimony. To minimize psychological damage, a specialized child psychologist was involved to ensure a maximally comfortable and safe communication atmosphere. The work required an extraordinarily careful approach. The psychologist meticulously worked with investigators, compiling a list of the most traumatic questions that could negatively impact the child's emotional state. Unfortunately, the testimony of the 10-year-old schoolboy differed little from the accounts of other family acquaintances. The boy sincerely did not understand the reasons why his father had decided to commit such a terrible crime. He first heard his parents discussing something animatedly when going to bed, but with a child's mind, he did not grasp the essence of their conversation. During the therapeutic session, the boy spoke about a loud fan, whose monotonous hum, in his opinion, had drowned out the sounds of gunshots. He was almost certain that it was because of this noise that he had not awakened earlier. The child categorically confirmed that Jonathan had never exhibited cruelty or aggression. The man had never raised his hand against his wife or children. Detectives were particularly interested in why none of the children had reacted to the shooting. Judging by the position of the bodies, the children were sleeping soundly and were shot in their sleep, not even aware of the danger. That tragic night, fate was merciless. Forensic experts suggested that the small-caliber pistol used by Jonathan created significant noise but could simultaneously not be loud enough to attract neighbors' attention. The younger son reported that fans were standing in all rooms, which likely masked the sounds of gunshots. Police were forced to ask the child extremely unpleasant questions about the tragedy's details. However, the boy became increasingly nervous and ultimately began to cry. The child psychologist immediately decided to stop the interrogation to prevent deepening the psychological trauma. Relatives noticed that after meeting with law enforcement, the boy became much more nervous. He required additional psychological support, as he had only begun emotional recovery, and painful memories once again plunged him into a state of fear and despair. A decision was made not to further disturb the child with additional interrogations, especially considering potential media resonance. Journalists, as is known, are often less tactful, so collective efforts managed to ensure maximum confidentiality for the affected schoolboy. The boy temporarily settled with his aunt, who was appointed official guardian. It is anticipated that funds collected through a charitable foundation will be used to provide him with psychological help and support in overcoming his traumatic experience. Psychological scars from the experienced tragedy still do not give peace to the only surviving family members. Panic attacks and horrible nightmares that pursue the boy do not subside, despite all efforts of medical professionals. His aunt is full of hope that the received compensation will provide not only comprehensive rehabilitation but also allow him to obtain an education and build a new life in the future. However, everyone understands that no amount of money can return the lost loved ones. The boy has a challenging path of recovery ahead, supported by close people who are trying to do everything possible to help him survive the irreparable loss. Investigators gradually reconstructed an approximate picture of the tragic events. It all began with an ordinary family argument that unexpectedly turned into a horrific tragedy. After a heated conflict, the man grabbed a weapon, and his first victim was his wife, Lindsay. She received a severe wound and fell to the floor, bleeding. The woman quickly lost consciousness but was still alive. It seemed that something incredible was happening. The man who had just wounded his wife did not stop. On the contrary, being in a state of uncontrolled rage, he continued his terrible path of revenge. The first encounter on his path was 18-year-old Dylan. The father shot his own son in the head without the slightest hesitation. It turned out that the older son was using earplugs, likely to avoid hearing the parental argument before his work shift. Perhaps this detail could have changed the course of tragic events, but that would never be known. The next victims were the children, Ethan and Lucas. Both were instantly killed with a shot to the head. Strangely, the youngest 10-year-old son remained alive. It is still unknown whether this was a conscious mercy or a simple coincidence. Realizing what he had done, Jonathan went downstairs to the living room and finally ended the tragedy with a shot to his own head. Within minutes, 5 out of 6 members of the Cendy family ceased to exist. On April 23, the Painless team, of which Ethan was a member, held a memorial event. Concerned people came to say goodbye to the deceased, honoring their memory. Each of the murdered family members remained in memories as a unique personality. 39-year-old Lindsay, a caring homemaker who dedicated herself to the family. 18-year-old Dylan, a kind young man ready to support his loved ones at any moment. 14-year-old Ethan, a smart and clever player who knew how to support friends and teammates. The loss of 12-year-old Lucas was especially painful, the youngest victim who did not even suspect the deadly threat. 42-year-old Jonathan was still remembered by most as a wonderful father and husband who knew how to diffuse any tense atmosphere. At the press conference, detectives unequivocally stated that Jonathan was the family's murderer. Forensic experts were able to exclude any other suspects, but the exact reason for such a devastating tragedy remained unknown. Even after several months of investigation, no new significant data appeared. This circumstance became an excellent basis for various journalistic speculations and rumors. The surviving boy was forced to move to a new family due to constant media interest. He continues to struggle with psychological trauma, but according to his aunt, he has considerable spiritual strength and potential to overcome everything experienced. Life goes on, and despite the tragic nature of events, there remains hope that someday the pain of loss will slightly subside, and memories of loved ones will not be so painful. I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe to the channel. Until next time, friends.